Ask anyone about Liverpool in the 60s and the chances are the first thing they'll say is the Beatles. It's true that the four-man rhythm and blues combo that first played here at what was the original Cavern Club on the 21st of February 1961 went on to be the biggest band in the world. They changed the shape of popular music and put just one place on everyone's lips: Liverpool. But this film is not just about the Beatles. Far from it. It's about a city that's on the up, alive with passion and pride, and setting new standards for everyone else to follow. The 60s were a time of great change for Merseyside. The whole area looked to the future with a fresh new air of self-confidence, a greater understanding of its strengths, and a solid determination to succeed. A major rebuild policy was generating new opportunities out of the devastation caused by the German bombers of World War II. A new youth culture was beginning to make its mark with bright new ideas and creativity. The city was buzzing with activity, and the docks on both sides of the Mersey were packed to overflowing. Birkenhead docks were handling around 3 million tonnes of imports and 1.5 million tonnes of exports every year. And at Liverpool, demand was so great that over £20 million was spent on reconstructing the Langdon and Canada docks. And Her Majesty the Queen was there to open them in 1962.
The docks, well, everyone was working in Liverpool. They all worked on the docks. All the wagons were down here, team horse and carts, steam wagons, the end of the steam wagons. Everyone worked, 2 men on a wagon. Great. You shifted everything by hand. There was no cranes, there was nothing outside the dock shed here. You done it with your mate and you lifted it and you done your job by hand. There was no computers and whatever it is we've got today that can kill the jobs.
This pub, the Atlantic, on the Dock Road, is one of my favourite Liverpool pubs. It's quiet at the moment. But I can remember being in this pub in the 60s when it was absolutely packed with dockers. And this is during the middle of the day. Don't ask me what they're doing in here instead of being on the docks. That's not my business. All I know is that they were in and they were part of a thriving port. This was, as far as we were concerned in Liverpool, the greatest port in the world. Bar none, New York, not in the make-specs with Liverpool. Everybody was full of confidence, everybody was working, and of course the dockers not only were working, but they were also getting very, very well paid, you know, by working class standards. And this pub, as I say, was a centre of that, being on the Dock Road. It was absolutely terrific. I mean, the dockers have always been, and still are today, a very special breed of people. They've got a double dose of the traditional sense of humour, if you like. And I can remember in this very pub, Jimmy Tarbuck, who in the 60s, of course, was in the very early stages of his career. He'd just been on the London Palladium, and he'd done brilliantly, and we were all made up for him as well. But I can remember Jimmy Tarbuck being in this pub, just listening to the dockers talk, and he'd write down little notes. And it was nothing unusual, a couple of weeks later, on the London Palladium, to hear the same words that you'd heard in this very pub and pubs like it on the Dock Road. And that's how important Liverpool was in the 60s. That's how important the docks were in the 60s. This was the centre of the world.
From the Atlantic to the Atlantean, Merseyside's rickety old buses were more than ready to be pensioned off. And in 1962, the city took delivery of its brand new fleet of Atlantean super luxury buses. Seen here on the streets of Wallasey, the new double-deckers were put into service just in time for the Christmas rush. The car workers of Merseyside have put millions of cars on Britain's roads. This was the very first. Job number 1 on the 8th of May 1963, with the Lord Mayor David Lewis at the wheel. Merseyside was also leading the field politically. A Labour stronghold for almost 2 generations, it owed a good deal of its strength to a young man born in Huddersfield but raised in Liverpool. Elected to Parliament in 1945, 2 years later, at the age of 31, he became the youngest cabinet minister this century, and in 1964 overturned a massive Conservative majority and won the keys to 10 Downing Street. The MP for Huyton, Harold Wilson.
Harold came down very frequently and held his surgeries. We had a lot of Liverpool housing stock. I know 20 years, but it wasn't a great time after the war. We had lots and lots of problems, and especially with housing and people needing housing and young families, children. But there was this father figure there, Harold. If you had a problem, he solved it, and that was the feeling. I'd hate to say he felt like God Almighty, but there was that feeling amongst people. Well,
there was a euphoria, but I think, you know, problems about unemployment. He said, right, what we'll do, we'll bring Ford Motor Company here, won't we? And he got Ford Motor Company brought here, as you probably know.
There were good times, the 60s.
Do you remember, he used to, at the election, he used to come here, and he used to wander down the road, and he'd say, God, old Haddle, that's right, you know. And he was the Prime Minister, but, you know, he was wandering down, smoking his pipe and so on, and
the special branch used to be there.
And Arthur Smith, who had bad feet, used to be with him. Did you remember going, come on, Arthur, go on.
He was a man of the people.
Wilson was certainly no fool. In 1965, Liverpool's adopted son honoured 4 other Liverpudlians with the MBE. The 60s also saw the making of Naughty Ash's biggest star. Ken Dodd was knocking them dead with sell-out summer seasons and packed Christmas specials. Here he is with the Tiller Girls, helping out with the Christmas rush at the Liverpool sorting office. The Beatles were just part of the explosion of creative talent on Merseyside during the 60s. Groups of talented young writers and performers gathered to discuss ideas and to make their mark on the arts. The city undoubtedly provided some of the country's most gifted poets since the war. 3 of the most talented were Roger McGough, Brian Patton and Adrian Henry.
There is obviously something about Liverpool. It is one of those places where things happen, and almost despite the obvious problems, that somehow or other there's always something going on, there's always something interesting. And for instance, the reason I came here was because in the late 50s it was very much an artist town. It was painters and sculptors, and there was a whole crowd of us who used to live in this district that I still live in and go to the same pub and so on. It was very much like the sort of left bank in Paris or something. And so really there's always, you felt there's always, this town has always got something happening in it. And the poetry really was the kind of, the new thing that happened, I suppose, in the 60s, because it didn't necessarily have a major kind of poetry tradition before that. And what happened really was that there were three of us who people know about. Brian Patton had just left school with no O-levels at age 15 and was working as a cub reporter on the Beatles Times. Roger McGough had just come back from Hull University with a degree in French, and he was going to do some teaching. And I was teaching at Manchester Art College and commuting over to Manchester because I didn't like Manchester, I wanted to stay in Liverpool. And I guess it's the Irish and maybe the Welsh tradition. I mean, it's a Celtic city, isn't it, really? I mean, both Ireland and Wales, I mean, they are very much places about words and songs and music. And I guess also, I suppose, West Indian. It's a great tradition of storytelling and things. So somehow all the elements in the mixture that makes up most people here, I mean, are very much word conscious and the famous sense of humour, obviously. You have to open your ears and listen any time, you know, on the bus or whatever, and people just say amazing things.
No one perhaps more amazing than Adrian himself, who along with Roger McGough and John Gorman was pushing back the boundaries of 60s theatre at Hope Hall.
The first event we did was called City, and we tried to portray a sort of instant cityness, sort of a confusion of images, of sounds, smells, music, action, words, which would give us a sort of essence of city. And we used some local dancers, not professional dancers, but more people who rather enjoy twisting and jiving and tend to do it rather well.
Not surprisingly, with all that creativity around, the theatre was enjoying something of a boom time, especially here in Hope Street, where the old Hope Hall was transformed by 3 students from Birmingham University into the Everyman.
It was a few students from Birmingham who started the theatre, and they wanted to do exciting theatre and change the world the way students like to. Kerry Hands is the director of the RSC. Peter James is the director of the Lyric Theatre. I think it's special because it's always been a people's theatre. You don't have to get dressed up. You just come casual, comfortable. I don't mean scruffy. Do you know what I mean? Relaxed. As far as I know, the biggest success was John McGraw's Soft or a Girl. And they also had a big success with John, George, Paul, Ringo and Bert, one of Willie Russell's.
Trevor Eve as Paul, Philip Joseph as George, Anthony Sher as Ringo, and Bernard Hill as John. An impressive cast. The Playhouse underwent extensive alterations, gaining an attractive new restaurant, coffee lounge and buttery bar. The Playhouse's success was truly international. The whole company travelled to Florence in Italy with a production of Willis Hall's The Long and the Short and the Tall. Other big box office tours to visit the Playhouse were The Spinners, Sooty with Harry Corbett and John Osborne's Look Back in Anger. Tickets for the theatre started at around 8 bob, or 40p. Unlike the theatre, tragedy in real life means great pain, and it would be impossible to ignore one of the decade's most heartbreaking mistakes, thalidomide. One of Britain's greatest wartime heroes, Group Captain Douglas Bader, who lost both his legs in the Second World War, is seen here visiting some of the young thalidomide victims at Alderhay Hospital. Merseyside in the 60s meant build, and build it big. Some of the most memorable developments, and those that perhaps have had the greatest effect on the area, involved the need to prepare the city for increasing demands from traffic and the population. Plans were afoot for both Liverpool and Birkenhead to get a new shopping centre, but both were to have their problems. In Liverpool in 1964, work began on demolishing St John's Market, originally opened in 1822. The old market was cleared to make way for a £10 million St John's Precinct project. Work was expected to be completed by November 67, but a series of problems and hold-ups kept putting the opening date further and further back, until the now famous beacon still being fitted, the car park and the hotel unfinished, and 100,000 over target, it was finally opened in April 1970. At the same time in Birkenhead, an inquiry had investigated the need for a new shopping centre in the Grange Road area, and that was given the green light. Work also began on one of Liverpool's most remarkable buildings, the Roman Catholic Cathedral, a vast concrete conical arena surmounted by a multicoloured concrete and glass crown with 50-foot-high pinnacles of fiberglass. It's a building that always creates a reaction. As the Archbishop of Liverpool, the late Most Reverend George Beck, said at the time of its consecration in 1967, "You can love it or you can loathe it, but you can't ignore it." The design tender attracted over 300 entries from all over the world, but the winning design was one from much respected Briton, Sir Frederick Gibbard. On the horticultural side of things, 1960